This shall be a recording in which I explain my little fantasy worlds. Alright, it is beginning now. So, I got bored and I decided to make a fantasy world of an island. This fantasy world is pretty similar to our own, following all our laws of physics. It's not going to have any magic. Honestly, it's more of a world building simulation. As you can see, this is land and it is color coded to represent different biomes, obviously in a key. The island is composed of mostly limestone. What formed this island was the what do you call it? I will get back to that. What formed this island was 3 different types of plate collisions. Is it convection? Alright. This was caused by this island's formation was caused by the convergence of 2 different. Oh my gosh, I can't remember what it was called. My search history. This was caused by the convergence of 2 different plates. Del Western plate and Del Eastern plate. And this led to the formation. This led to the plates folding over each other and producing this massive mountain range. And slowly over time, that process led to kind of like a ring of mountains gathering, and then the ocean currents slowly, more and more sediment was accumulated to this mountain range, which was quite big, and then it slowly became added on, and because of the whole divergent thing, lava, as the plates were folding together, could escape deep from the Earth's crust, and that added all these features. Now, how does this island work, you ask? Well, it works as any island would. It's affected by the climate. No, it's affected by the latitude, the longitude, etc. So, you ask, what effect are the currents playing upon this island? Well, I shall show you. So, the ocean currents. We have our warm facing our ocean currents, and generally everything seems to be going in a easterly direction. These ocean currents are landing here, 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 and here. And those other ocean currents go around and continue going along there. And then we have the cold ocean currents, and in the south, the ocean's much more colder, leading to it should be a colder climate, but due to a lack of rainfall and the like, it is not actually a colder climate. So, yeah, that's going on. We have all this, basically all the wind's going east, and it deposits. Alright, let's cancel that, that's no longer necessary. We have all this wind going east, and it's depositing a lot. It doesn't like to rain in this kind of drier Mediterranean shrubland, as the clouds, I don't exactly know why. Actually, I'll just not include that in the video. As you can see, this biome is a warm, temperate maritime, a brilliant environment capable of farming grains, very fertile, and just good for human settlement. As you shall see later on. Then, deeper in this continent, we have a mixed broadleaf forests. They're quite dense forests, again, a lot of rainfall. Then we have temperate grasslands where the trees didn't quite gain root because the soil was never quite wait, why couldn't the trees gain root? Because the soil was never quite never quite deep enough, as it was quite limestone-ish. We have some heathland because of the winds over here. It doesn't really affect the maritime environment, but it does affect deeper, further into the continent. We have some temperate rainforest here, as all the rain, this is quite mountainous terrain, and all the rain's being deposited here. Now, as you can see, yeah, this is all the evidence for what I'm saying. As it grows more mountainous, we have a temperate montane forest, full of pine trees and quite mountainous, with the soil's quality slowly depleting. And then we have a cloud forest, because all of the island's water is concentrated here. As when it goes further up, it deposits all its water here. This is where most of the island's water is, forming a massive lake, which is also contributed by the melting of glaciers in this mountain tundra habitat. So look at this beautiful part of the island ripe for human settlement. Due to the cold ocean currents, that leads to what you call it, less coastal upwelling, so less fish in that. But it just generally the rain doesn't go here because I said so, and I can't remember how that works as a natural process. Now over here we have a calcareous woodland, which it does get enough rain to support trees in that, but the soil is so limey and shallow and that they can also only support kind of not the prettiest woodland, but to support one. Then over here, it's a semi-arid steppe with barely any rain and only a few hardy grasses clinging on. Over here are the coastal scrub regions. Again, affected by this mountain, they are on the leeward side of the mountain and cannot receive any rain or the like, as it was all deposited here. Meanwhile, in this region, most of the rain falls here and only a bit can afford to fall here. Then it slowly runs out. Yeah, so that's a pretty quick summary of my island. I could go more in depth about the forces which influence it, but I cannot be bothered. Now, I shall show you the prehistory of this island. So, look at this beautiful, beautiful island. The first peoples to arrive on this island crossed across an ancient land bridge, and they were called the primary tribe. And these people, they were tall and they were quite tan-skinned, and their ancestors had a habit of migrating. So they arrived in year 200, and a group of them decided to settle down in the calcareous woodland, and they can be mentioned later. But another group decided to wander along the eastern coast. As we can see, stuff is happening, but for now, they settled over there. And another group settled all along the west coast, including coastal scrub and other environments. Then eventually, a group of them, a subset of them, settled into the temperate rainforest, which they will regret later on, and another part of them settled in all these forests over here. These peoples never really learnt how to live on plains, and they never settled those areas, because it's just not their custom and tradition. And another group settled beside this massive lake. They're gonna do some awesome stuff later down the line. And this group, they settled up in the mountains of a dry woodland. Now, look at this just beautiful world, man. It's all one group. Actually, no, what am I saying? So, originally it was just this group, but then upon boats came the secondary tribe. These people first settled upon this island. These people were master kayakers and people of the ocean. They're called ocean peoples. I'll look at that later. They settled here, here, and here. And those were the islanders people. And they also settled all along the coast. Now, one group of them decided to settle in these temperate grassland plains. And they followed a more agrarian route, and their civilization diverged quite a lot from this group. And then another group, seeing the massive amounts of land, although it wasn't quite as good as this land, decided to invade. And they displaced the original populations here in a vicious and bloodthirsty campaign. And these peoples were forced to flee into the semi-arid steppe areas. Now, I haven't fleshed out all the lore for this world, but this is what I've done so far, and it will be constantly refined. But honestly, what I want is to publish a video on YouTube, and this shall be my first video. Anyway, moving on. We have my political map, which I've made so far. Yeah, that's it for that line's for international borders. That one's for national divisions. Oh, I spell everything wrong because I can't spell. Example states. That's for towns. That's for cities. That's for capitals, and that's for villages. But I haven't thought of any of it. So as you can see, I have been detailing quite a lot, but I have not quite finished. So here, now let's begin with the very beginning. The first ever group, the ancient primary group, the first people to ever arrive. These people, as I said earlier, crossed the ancient land bridge, and originally these people were nomadic hunter-gatherers looking for better land. And these people settled in this region. However, most of them just decided to move on as they did not like this harsh woodland environment. And I've already showed you those people who moved on. But then, these people stayed, right? And these people originally were similar to that, to the other tribes, but luckily their habitat, I don't know why I say it like that, animals, would actually support a civilization later on. Despite the quite harsh terrain, limestone soil mixed with quite a low landfall, not enough rainfall to support a forest, but not little enough to become a desert, that's the kind of balance we had, only could support a woodland environment. But luckily, they found small, fertile pockets around oases or, cisterns, like they have in the Central America. And these people could grow grain. They grew wheat, emmer, rye, and barley, and some others. But in the less fertile regions, these people saw all the nut trees and fruit trees growing, and they decided to develop orchards. And this would be the start of something quite remarkable. They had chestnuts, hazelnuts, acorns, and walnuts. They also had apples, pears, cherries, plums, apricots, and a hell lot of berries. These foods, because they could be preserved, the grain made into bread, the apples dried, and the nuts processed and, made into bread also, or just preserved, they slowly could build up surpluses of grain. And with these surpluses of grain, those who owned the grain eventually became aristocrats and lords. Yeah. And then some peoples decided to settle upon the coast, eating, fish, eating a fairly similar diet to the other people. But most of them stayed inland, and then eventually proto-cities developed, supported by extensive trade routes. The forests were cleared, but they weren't destroyed. Instead of destroying their initial woodlands to grow grain, they actually planted massive amounts of orchards and mastered how to grow those plants. They built massive roads by a shared effort, which they decided to take upon all the aristocratic lords, as they didn't want to destroy the orchards to make navigation easier, so they decided to build roads. But these roads were only primitive gravel roads made from limestone gravel. So it's not that remarkable, but what's remarkable is they had unity to do that. And these roads allowed civilization to become centralized. The chiefs, as I said, became aristocrats, shamans became priests, and at the beginning, the power was really scattered. But the construction of the roads allowed power to be centralized. Armies could rapidly travel across these roads and invade, and they could also travel along the coastal villages in boats and ships offshore. And also, because orchards could provide a food source, the population was more sparse and scattered. Which, while you think this might support decentralization, actually, why would it not support decentralization? Think! This allowed there to be a lot of small power bases and lords who would be able... I don't actually know. I'll just retract that. Oh no, this looks dumb. I don't like this looks dumb. Anyway, so yeah, essentially, oh yeah, I know how it worked. So essentially, these aristocrats, they saw that the merchants along the coast were gaining a lot of power through trade and also through trade on the roads. And the priest caste had a lot of power in the proto-urban cities as they were around, water sources, and they could construct a religion which basically gave them divine authority over these water sources. And as there was all this conflicting interest, the aristocrats supported a single emperor to bring stability and order. And this led to a pretty complex social order. Yeah. And this is a Chris. Wait. Curse to. Curse to Pocket. Curse Topican. Curse Topican Empire. I can't even pronounce my own empires. Oh my gosh. And they settled down here. And they are pretty powerful, but also a very ancient civilization. Now we have another group, and these are the people who decided to continue their emigration. And they entered into that harsh coastal scrub region I mentioned earlier, and they had nothing to rely upon but the seas, so they ate, fish, shellfish, squids, crabs, seabirds, seaweed, and a few hardy salt-tolerant roots. And some of these people decided to settle along bays and estuaries and form villages, but another group decided to continue their immigration, which in their religion is called the eternal migration, and become nomads. These people are facilitators of land trade, commerce, and they also spread many ideas and concepts, particularly from this empire, and some of those ideas are starting to stir around in this land. Now, of course, because this is such a massive region, there's no one leader, and power is quite decentralized, with chieftains, different chiefdoms, mainly in charge of the villages. These chiefdoms form defensive alliances against the nomads, who quite frequently decide to give up their nomadic ways and become raiders and attack the villages. As the villagers receive a wealth of goods from here, from Kirstokopican, from trade, I mean. They receive a lot of grain, a lot of minerals, a lot of metal, and these nomads want that for themselves. They want the wealth that the villagers have. And these villagers make all their money by selling little trinkets and for the upper classes and the like, such as salt pearls, shells, misspelt coral, and just loads more stuff. But without the trade, these villagers would really be in a bad situation because they cannot make barely any food here. Yeah. And military centralization was necessary, so they never really developed aristocracies or republics. In one village, there is a single chiefdom because they gotta fend off these nomads. And the people, both of the different groups, do follow a sea cult, and they're called the Sea Peoples. Yes, I know, not the original name, but that's what I'm calling them for now. This brown group, I haven't quite written about them yet, but they're the dry woodland kind of dwellers. There's also going to be a lot of other groups, man. I mean, every time this, you have a first initial tribe. Every time there's a split between them, whether it be religious or etc., it's going to be a different group. But especially what causes the biggest difference is when they settle a different biome. Now we have these people who decided to settle into the temperate rainforest. These guys are related to these guys, but I'll mention them later. Yeah. And the other guys, they decided to continue going south and living in the forest, but these people chose to live in the harshest possible forest, with crowded undergrowth, steep terrain, and just horrific moisture. And it rains about 2,000 millimeters a year, to put it in perspective, makes it just utterly inhospitable. And only a small population of wild game exists, and plants are just really difficult to forage. Luckily, the rivers and the coasts do provide some water-based foods like shellfish, fish, but there's not much outside of that. Although some just live away from these water sources, and I have no idea how. Actually, well, they are managing, but they're not living nice lives. And these tribes, they had to have a lot of customs, don't eat with poisonous berries. Don't leave your food out. Don't fall down a steep cliff and die, essentially. And this led to them having a very complicated and almost legalistic religion. And part of this religion included war cannibalism, where they consumed the flesh of their enemies. This was initially because there was just so little food and they had to resort to cannibalism, but then it eventually became sacred in their religion. And when one tribe would defeat another tribe, the winning tribe would eat the losers. I know, utterly terrifying. They're very fierce, violent, and living brutish and miserable lives. I think that's some John Locke quote. And outsiders are terrified of them and don't go anywhere near them. They're the warrior cannibals. And some of them who actually have went to civilization are ferocious mercenaries. Now we have the people who kind of live in a mixed broadleaf forest, and as you can see, their territories aren't exactly the most nicely divided. Now these people, as I said, they're the ones who continued immigrating. This forest provides them safety from a lot of other groups and also relatively abundant resources for a hunter-gatherer civilization. They also are quite nomadic and immigrate a lot following seasonal routes. However, the forest, as it's hard to navigate, it takes some years to really complete these. No, what am I saying? That makes no sense. Anyway, yeah, the struggle with logistics, communication, and with trade is non-existent, which means they're really decentralized and just live as tribal chiefdoms. They live off big game, deers, boars, mixed with some nuts, wild fruits, mushrooms, and tubers. A lot of other cultures, especially the secondary group, the settlers, look down at them as savages, but yeah, that's just what people do. And this is a forest peoples. However, deep buried in this tribe's religion, because they did inherit some of their religion from this group, because they were initially the same group, they have this concept of a god king, who is a figure, a prophetic figure, who will, well, to explain why they have this religious figure, it's not only because this tribe, the temperate rainforest guys had to develop a very complex religion to survive. These people also have to compete with this tribe and have to compete with the settlers who have settled along the rivers and taken all the fine land and destroyed the forest. And these people, they're called the riverine Vonacerians. Some of them are actually nice to these forest peoples and they merge and intermingle their cultures. And some religious elements from both their ancestral history and this new group they've encountered have contributed to this god king figure in their religion. However, in other spots, there's a massive conflict and they regularly kill each other and the settlers enslave these poor people. So the god king, what does he do? He shall unite all the forest people's tribes and expel the invaders and restore the rivers which to their control of the native peoples. Which and they see the rivers as kind of lifelines of the earth. Yeah, I think that'd be really cool. That's just so good for a book. Yeah, so I've explained all of the primary peoples. I still have more to write, but I shall do that later. And this is my first YouTube video, don't judge. So we have a secondary group called, these are the Ocean Men, that was their name, and they built kayaks, canoes, rafts, crossed a fairly small ocean, but I'm not showing what it looks like over there because that ruins the immersion, to reach this island. Initially, yeah, and they speak a language called Vonacarian. Vonacarian, but that's just their general name from now on. They, yeah, as I said earlier, they're a maritime-based people. They live off fish, barley specifically, legumes, olives, grapes, root crops, and citrus. They don't have a lot of raw metals, but they had enough to learn how to make copper, iron, tin, zinc, copper, and silver to smelt those. And over time, they were just living on the coast, slowly developing, with the barley really helping to give them stability and surplus for civilization to develop. And yeah, we have these villages turning into towns, and then people who were once chiefs or just family heads or patriarchs or matriarchs or I don't know what they're doing, they became aristocrats, and eventually, yeah, There were two different kind of sets of aristocrats: the ones who owned all the grain and the ones who owned the shipbuilding. And the shipbuilding enabled all these different villages to be connected, essentially like city-states. And their religion did worship the sea, as of course they do. I mean, they're a maritime people who traveled a massive distance to get to this island. And eventually, we have all these different families competing, and there's a lot of war and violence. So eventually, they decided to form a kind of, it's kind of like a semi-united confederacy of city-states, but eventually these city-states, they saw that they had to give the common people a lot of rights, so they became kind of oligarchic republics where really only the aristocrats could win, but they had to win the support of the commoners in their election. And this place is called the Vonne Karen Fassalocracy, or whatever you call it. And then we have this group, and these are the river versions of these people. They speak the same language, but they speak it with more of an accent. They're like the country, whatchamacall them? They're like the Texans, essentially. And they went down these rivers, and they essentially have the same system, but there are slight differences. They worship the rivers a lot more, seeing it as a kind of, they see the land and sea as kind of separate entities, and the rivers as being in between that and a uniter, kind of like invisibly in between. It's complicated. You have to ask one of these people. However, these people can't grow quite as much grain, so they grow a lot more root vegetables. They have a lot more orchids, and they live off orchards, and they have to depend a lot more on wild game, which they find in the forest. And because they're really scattered and fragmented, and there's a lot of steep mountains around these rivers and the like, they're very fractured. And this means there's a lot of diversification in culture, political systems, etc. We have monarchies, republics, tribal councils, and even theocracies. And a lot of these places only control their single river valley. And as I said earlier, these people do intermingle a lot with the forest peoples. However, when these people do mix up with the other cultures, and generally this whole group in general does that a lot, although some of them are hardliners against it, the original group looks upon these people as kind of like, mixing with the enemy and as heretics and impure because their religious beliefs are also different. So this does cause a bit of conflict and means that the coastal Vonakeranes cannot really assert control over the riverine ones, causing, they're the same people, but they're slowly going different ways, and they might end up hating each other in the end. So now we have a last culture, and these are the people who settle upon the temperate grasslands. And these people are called the Thai Vernacularanes. And they speak virtually the same language. Now, these people are mostly dependent on grain, and they have the same Bronze/Iron Age technology. However, these people live upon grasslands, which means, firstly, growing grain's pretty easy. Secondly, there's a lot of herd animals, which means wealth is more transitional and fluid, and also settlement and population is more transitional and fluid, as they are semi-nomadic, and invasions and raids occur a lot more and are more commonplace. And because of this, power had to be centralized under warlords. So we have these grain-growing areas, and then we have all the nomadic areas outside of that, and they kind of move around and kind of coexist at the same time, but there's still a small kind of urban class. And they developed cavalry, and they fought a lot, and eventually different chiefs slew different chiefs, grew more powerful, grew bigger herds, controlled more cities, and they became warrior kings. And generally, most of these blue regions are ruled by a single warrior king. However, the other terrain does divide them up. And these people have a hierarchical social structure, and there's different levels of initiation, and a lot of it's based around martial ability and how good they are at fighting. And we also have a religion worshipping the sun, and there's a bit of king worship mixed up with it. And these people commonly raid all the other peoples around them, and they are called the Thai Vinay Karen Grassland Kingdoms. Yeah, no, not the best name. Now that should be my recording, and yeah, that's just explaining my law. I hope you enjoy. I took half an hour to do that. Wow.